No one knew how I secretly watched my father's nanny and ex-wife steal $28,000 from his college fund. Their mistakes, arguments, and public meltdowns gradually destroyed their lives. I watched patiently until their entire world began to crumble. And this is only the beginning. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. No one suspected that I'd seen it all from the start, and that my patience wasn't a sign of indifference, but calculation. At first, it seemed like a typical family story. Father, another marriage after divorce, the certainty that now everything would be different. But the arrival of the nanny was no mere coincidence. She entered our lives as if from a wall and immediately began imposing rules that everyone in the house somehow agreed to. At first, I only saw fleeting things. Attentiveness to the children in public, perfect photos of family holidays on social media, compliments to acquaintances, as if she did everything with good intentions. But I knew from my father about the existence of a college fund, which the family carefully funded in the names of my brother and cousins. It was the one thing that couldn't be touched in any unforeseen situation. When small discrepancies appeared in the bank statements, I didn't rush to accuse anyone outright, because in such cases, a mistake costs trust and the chance for a fair outcome. I gained access to a copy of the Foundation's latest financial statement not through any hacking exploits, but because a fundraising employee, by simple chance, sent a document to the wrong person, and I saw it. It contained numbers, dates, and a small line that no one would have noticed if they hadn't been able to read between the lines. Odd transactions, transfers, notes in the temporary allocation column. This was the confirmation that forced me to look more closely. I didn't immediately understand who could have written off the money and how. I had no desire to pin names and break up families in a hurry. I began to observe, but to observe with the goal of understanding the pattern, not simply catching one single mistake. As I watched, I noticed that the nanny acted differently when she thought she wasn't being seen. A stern, strict approach to paperwork, unexpected calls at inconvenient times, and brief encounters with someone she called an old acquaintance. It was these old acquaintances that caught my attention, because one of them turned out to be my father's ex-wife, with whom we all had a complicated past, but who, for some reason, very quickly established a close relationship with the nanny. The subtle cunning of their behavior shone through their smiles, and I began to assemble the fragile pieces of the puzzle. Receipts for amounts that physically couldn't be related to purchases for the children. A photo of a receipt accidentally left in the corner of a bag on the table. Screenshots of messages I managed to see when I peeked at my phone for a minute when no one was looking. I wasn't pretending to be a hero. I wasn't proud of these moments. But they were details that added up to something more than just a family intrigue. The key was not that I found isolated transactions, but that they followed a specific pattern. Small transfers, carefully designed to evade automated checks, then a collection at one point and a large withdrawal through third parties. I didn't try to falsify the facts of the theft itself, because I already had reason to believe that the money had gone not just somewhere, but to people who, under the guise of caring, had drawn others into it. Instead of immediately going to my father with accusations, I decided to act smarter. I needed to achieve two things. First, gather evidence that couldn't be interpreted otherwise, and second, provoke a situation so that the accomplices would begin to make mistakes that would confirm their involvement. To achieve this, I didn't fake the theft. I created several small but realistic leaks that looked like leaks, not large document forgeries, but rather subtle clues that might have appeared in someone's correspondence or conversation. I arranged for certain people to receive hints that the Foundation had attracted unwanted attention. Anonymous reminders about appointments were sent to certain people. Personal items would accidentally appear in places where they might be noticed by those close to the nanny and the father's ex-wife. It looked like a perfectly human set of mistakes: forgotten receipts, chats with half-hearted explanations, calls cut off mid-sentence. But taken together, it became a thread that could be pulled and seen to see who would break first. At the same time, I carefully communicated with people connected to the Foundation, discreetly asking questions about typical procedures, requesting clarification of wording, and inquiring about the timing of fund distribution. Their answers, or lack thereof, provided me with additional insight. This is how I gained access to the correspondence that became crucial, not through some major hack, but through the revelation of someone who simply considered the nanny a friend and occasionally forwarded her screenshots of conversations, unaware that these fragments could be leaked. One such fragment was blindly forwarded to a general volunteer chat, and someone didn't notice that it contained a record of transfers and amounts. I saved these screenshots because they confirmed the patterns I'd already noticed. Many might say I overstepped my bounds by invading private conversations, but I saw it differently. When it came to my brother's future and the thousands earmarked for my children's education, silence and hesitation were betrayal. My strategy wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was a calculated effort to recoup what had been lost and to demonstrate that this was not the way to treat someone else's future. I waited for the perfect moment, for all the little details to fall into place, because an exposure that came too soon could easily be written off as a family squabble. And I knew that if I collected too little, they would simply shift their attention to someone else and sweep everything under the rug again. So I collected photographs of receipts, screenshots, transfer lists, conversations between volunteers and witnesses to small meetings. All this time, I remained outwardly calm, even maintaining the appearance of not noticing anything. This gave me two things: the opportunity to continue collecting information and an emotional advantage, because they felt safe and acted without a mask. After all, it seemed to me that revenge isn't a loud, screaming scene, but a carefully orchestrated process in which the truth must be revealed in a way that leaves no doubt in the minds of those who value a fair solution. And although at that moment I wasn't yet revealing the whole truth, I was clear on what it would be, and I was prepared to wait until all the fragments of the story came together to form a picture that couldn't be denied. From the moment I began to gently intervene in their daily lives, I saw how the small cracks I created gradually turned into more visible fissures. Every day I watched them as they tried to keep up appearances, smile, and act as if everything was fine, even though inside, their familial illusion was beginning to crumble. I understood that the most effective revenge is when people undermine their own reputation and trust, unaware of who's really behind it. They began arguing more frequently and over the most trivial things. Who should have paid the next bill? Who forgot something important in the documents? Who said too much at a family gathering? These quarrels were quiet, almost unnoticeable to outsiders, but I saw how the tension grew with each passing day, turning into chronic fatigue and irritation. My father's ex-wife, who had previously seemed so confident and powerful, now constantly listened to the nanny, scrutinizing her every word and gesture, trying not to make a mistake. With each passing week, the nanny lost her glimmer of confidence, her smiles became strained, and her conversations became less about family and more about excuses and explanations, as if she were trying to convince herself, not me, that her actions were unnoticed. I saw this influence gradually spread to the entire family. My father began to notice that the children were becoming nervous, that dinners that had previously been peaceful now ended with quiet reproaches and displeased glances. The children began to be afraid to ask questions because they sensed the tension emanating from the adults. I didn't intervene directly, but simply observed, recording the moments when the nanny and my father's ex-wife's mistakes created a chain of inconveniences and misunderstandings. Sometimes it was almost comical. Forgotten documents about stock transfers would surface at the most inopportune moments. Phone calls with important clarifications would be lost or delayed, and small details they considered insignificant suddenly began to affect their relationships. I watched as family friends and extended family members began to notice changes in the nanny's demeanor. Her smile became strained. She was no longer so persuasive and charming. Her usual manner of speaking about taking care of the children sounded false and unnatural. I noticed every moment when someone doubted her words and realized that these tiny moments of mistrust were the beginning of the end of the image she had so carefully cultivated. Sometimes she tried to compensate for her mistakes with overactivity, inventing new activities for the children, organizing gatherings or gifts, but this only exacerbated the situation. The more she tried to prove her worth, the more noticeable her mistakes and inconsistencies became. Every time they argued or tried to shift responsibility, I saw their relationship begin to disintegrate not only between them, but also within the family. I understood that the worst thing for them was losing control, and I was allowing them to lose it themselves. None of them suspected that these events were unfolding under my watch, and that I knew about their every move and every minor mistake they made. I didn't take any drastic action, didn't reveal my knowledge, and didn't interfere in their arguments, because every independent move by the nanny and my father's ex-wife was part of a plan. They were creating evidence of their own incompetence, nervousness, and greed. I saw how they were beginning to fear losing face in front of others, and how this anxiety was fueling new conflicts and misunderstandings between them. All these little things gradually escalated into a full-blown family drama. The father was confused, the children were anxious, friends and acquaintances began to notice strange changes in the nanny's behavior, and she herself was increasingly desperate, trying to maintain the illusion of stability. I saw their traditional roles in the family being disrupted. The nanny, once considered the center of trust and care, could no longer keep everyone under control. My father's ex-wife became suspicious and tense, and their life together felt like teetering on the edge of a precipice, where any misstep could lead to the collapse of the entire structure. And in this silence, which grew ever denser around them, I found a strange satisfaction. Revenge didn't require loud words or accusations. It manifested itself through the consequences of their own actions, through the destruction of the illusion they had built for so long. I watched as each misstep by the nanny triggered a chain reaction, how her little habits and weaknesses began to work against her, and how those around her began to notice that the perfect picture of the family was just a mask. This wasn't an investigation or an expose. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible drama in which their lives gradually unraveled publicly, without my direct aggression, and each new day brought new confirmation that my strategy was working, and that what they considered their advantage was now turning against them. Their every step, every forgotten task, every spontaneous reaction to others, every look full of tension and doubt was part of a larger puzzle I'd been assembling for years, and I saw the picture beginning to come together, even if they themselves didn't realize it. I understood that the final denouement was still to come, but it was precisely this process, watching the gradual destruction of the illusion, that was the sweet part of my revenge, and I allowed them to follow this path on their own, without direct intervention, watching their lives begin to unravel publicly, step by step. The morning when everything began to fall apart began as an ordinary family celebration, a birthday party for a younger relative. The whole family had gathered, the table was set, and the guests had arrived out of habit, but I could already see the tension in their eyes that had been building for weeks. The nanny tried to smile, to give orders and advice as always, but the smile was too forced, too artificial to hide the fear I had seen hidden for so long. Her movements became abrupt and hesitant, interrupting conversations, trying to cover for my father's ex-wife, who was also starting to get nervous. The petty squabbles and disagreements I had observed for months now surfaced simultaneously, and every guest could see that something was wrong. At first, these were quiet hints, forgotten words, strange glances, short, dissatisfied phrases that sounded indistinct but created an atmosphere of tension. But by the middle of the party, they had escalated into outright disagreements. The nanny tried to dictate who should help with the children. My father's ex-wife entered the fray, accusing her of failing to organize something on time, and I saw other relatives begin to exchange glances, realizing that the picture-perfect family was an illusion. I stood by, watching as minor mistakes, omissions, and pent-up resentment escalated into a major conflict before everyone's eyes. The children glanced around nervously, trying to figure out who was right and who was wrong, and I saw their trust in the nanny crumble before their eyes. Her usual authoritative words were no longer taken seriously. Her decisions were questioned even by their father, who was usually too loyal to her. I watched as my father's ex-wife, who had seemed confident and in control, began to lose her patience herself, her attempts to defend herself and the nanny looking pitiful and disjointed, and her every gesture only deepened the impression that everything they had built over the years was crumbling. At that moment, I realized that my entire plan for revenge was beginning to bear fruit. The mistakes and weaknesses they had demonstrated for months were now visible to everyone, and the consequences were becoming obvious. None of the guests knew the whole truth. No one guessed that I had been watching, collecting evidence, and enduring, allowing their own actions to destroy the illusion they had so carefully maintained. I watched as family friends and extended family members began to cautiously intervene, asking questions, clarifying details, making innocent remarks that the nanny and my father's ex-wife took as personal accusations. This only increased their nervousness. Their voices trembled, their sentences became harsh, and sometimes they interrupted each other before they could explain their actions, each moment intensifying the tension. The relatives began to split. Some tried to support the children and explain that the adults' mistakes weren't their fault, while others began quietly muttering among themselves, concluding that trust in the nanny and her ally had been undermined. I saw them trying to save face, but it was no longer possible. Minor offenses that had seemed unnoticeable in everyday life had now become public, and their reputation was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The nanny tried to regain control, pretending to be in charge, but her every gesture, every phrase, provoked doubt and ridicule. My father's ex-wife, seeing the plans fail, made desperate attempts to rectify the situation, but this only added to the chaos. She clashed with other relatives. Her attempts to explain financial mismanagement seemed hollow, and forgotten documents and casual mentions of the college fund began to surface in conversations. I watched my father struggle to maintain order, but he was unable to offset the emotional tension created by the nanny and my father's ex-wife. His words of calm and patience fell on deaf ears, who were already beginning to doubt their integrity. The children whispered nervously among themselves. The adults exchanged glances. Some tried to intervene to smooth things over, but each attempt only revealed new inconsistencies and contradictions. I watched their alliance unravel before my eyes. They tried to maintain a semblance of unity, but inside, they were already bickering, blaming each other, and unleashing pent-up mistrust. Every forgotten document, every awkward phrase, every mistake in organizing the party became clear to everyone, and I saw how it was destroying their social status and authority within the family. That day, I realized that revenge doesn't require open accusations or shouting. It's enough to allow people to destroy the illusion they believed in, and the consequences will be obvious to everyone around. When the party ended, the atmosphere was tense, almost sour. The nanny and my father's ex-wife stood at the threshold, as if unsure where to go or what to say. My father tried to maintain order. The children tried to remain calm, and I watched, documenting every moment and realized that the culmination of my plan was near. Their relationships within the family were undermined, trust shattered, authority lost, and no one could bring it back. I saw how the mistakes they had been making for months were now turning into clear consequences. Reputations were crumbling, the union between them was disintegrating, and their familiar image of the perfect family was an illusion that I patiently waited to destroy. It was the moment when hidden revenge became visible to everyone. Without shouting, without accusations, without investigations. Simply the consequences of their own actions, noted and amplified by my patience. And I understood that this was the beginning of the end of what they considered their safe and comfortable life. After that day, I saw the tension within the family and the mistakes of the nanny and my father's ex-wife begin to manifest in public, and it was truly captivating, even though I kept a calm face and didn't show anything to anyone. They could no longer hide their nervousness, and their attempts to maintain the appearance of control only made it worse. Every appearance at family gatherings, small events, or even random visits to friends turned into a test of their composure. I watched as the nanny tried to plan everything in advance down to the last detail, as if trying to anticipate everyone else's every move. But in reality, this only created chaos, because no one ever acts perfectly, and her nervous desire to control everything manifested itself in abrupt gestures, forgotten things, and slurred words. My father's ex-wife tried to back her up, but she herself was unable to cope with the internal tension and emotional burden. Their quarrels, which had previously remained between them, now took place in front of guests, friends, and distant relatives. I saw how every observer began to notice inconsistencies, odd behaviors, contradictory explanations, and spontaneous reactions that didn't fit the usual image of caring adults everyone was accustomed to. Sometimes they interrupted each other at the most inopportune moments, argued over the details of meeting arrangements, forgot to mention important things, began to panic over trivial matters, and their attempts to appear calm looked pathetic and unconvincing. I saw their usual mask of confidence gradually crack, and every time they were faced with a new question or comment from others, their faces betrayed their inner anxiety. Children glanced around nervously, trying to figure out what was going on. Relatives talked quietly among themselves, and I recorded every moment, every tremor of voice, every awkward pause, knowing it was all part of the plan I had patiently built for months. Sometimes the nanny tried to resort to familiar manipulation techniques, giving instructions, showing concern, diverting attention to someone else. But her attempts seemed mechanical, artificial, and those around her saw through it, even if they didn't understand the reason. My father's ex-wife did the same, trying to calm the situation, but her interventions only added to the tension, as she lost consistency in her words and actions. Gradually, mistakes and awkwardness accumulated, like small pebbles rolling down a mountain, and the images of them in those around her were eroded layer by layer. Sometimes a guest would ask a simple question about the foundation's past, upcoming events, or responsibilities, and this would provoke a near-panic reaction, sudden, short answers, sighs, and pauses that were forced out by nervous tension. These moments were so natural and unintentional that no one suspected my role. It seemed as if they were creating their own traps, and this gave me a hidden satisfaction. I watched their alliance begin to disintegrate. Instead of coordinated actions, spontaneous, contradictory decisions emerged, undermining any attempt to regain control. Sometimes the nanny would try to take the initiative, only to be abruptly interrupted by my father's ex-wife, resulting in both appearing disorganized and confused, which drew the attention of those around them. Standing nearby, I observed how family friends and distant relatives began making cautious comments, asking clarifying questions, and exchanging glances, as if trying to understand what was happening. Their behavior became almost a public revelation, only without the loud accusations, just a cumulative accumulation of obvious signs of incompetence and nervousness that spoke for themselves. When they tried to save face by adding smiles and explanations, it seemed even more unnatural, creating the effect that they were hiding more than they were revealing. I watched the mistakes snowball. One forgotten document, one awkward phrase, one harsh comment at the wrong time, and the tension increased exponentially. Sometimes I caught the children's glances as they tried to understand why the adults were acting so strangely, and it was obvious to me that their trust in the nanny and her ally had already been undermined, although they didn't yet understand how deeply. I watched as they began to make repeated mistakes, panic, and lose self-control, which created visible consequences for those around them, escalating the drama and pushing the situation toward a final turnaround. I watched the tension spread to everyone around me. Guests began whispering, family friends were talking among themselves, the children were becoming increasingly confused, and the nanny and my father's ex-wife were trying to maintain control, but each attempt seemed unsuccessful and only exacerbated the chaos. That morning, when everything finally spiraled out of control, it was the culmination of months of patiently observing and carefully guiding. Never before had I witnessed such a complete collapse in all areas of their lives at once, and every little thing they did only intensified the avalanche effect. The nanny and my father's ex-wife had started by being late for a family dinner, which was supposed to be just another formality, but this tardiness became a symbol of their inability to organize their lives. The children, already accustomed to seeing them nervous and making mistakes, looked at them with quiet distrust, and the relatives began to openly mutter among themselves, noticing that the familiar roles they had considered immutable were crumbling before their eyes. Even before dinner had begun, one of the older relatives indirectly mentioned the nanny's recent missteps with the college fund, and at that moment I saw her face turn pale. My father's ex-wife, horrified, tried to steer the conversation in a more neutral direction, but it seemed too late and unconvincing. What followed unfolded almost like a chain reaction. One misstep, a forgotten detail, an uncoordinated comment, and the tension escalated exponentially. The guests began to notice that the nanny was losing her composure. Her smiles became strained. Her voice trembled. She tried to pretend everything was under control, but her every gesture betrayed inner tension, fear, and confusion. My father's ex-wife tried to intervene, to explain or justify what was happening, but her phrases were confused, sometimes contradictory, and those around her began to perceive this as weakness and an inability to manage the situation. I observed how even young children sensed the emotional chaos and began to act more independently, no longer obeying the nanny's instructions, which only heightened her sense of loss of control. Then, events took an even more dramatic turn. One of the relatives mentioned recent gossip that had reached neighbors and family acquaintances, and I saw their eyes fill with fear and panic as they realized their mistakes and short-sightedness were becoming a topic of discussion beyond the family. The social pressure became unimaginably intense. Friends, colleagues, and foundation volunteers began indirectly expressing dissatisfaction and doubt, which the nanny and my father's ex-wife perceived as personal attacks, provoking even more sharp and nervous reactions. Their attempts to justify or explain what was happening seemed false, and the harder they tried, the more mistakes were revealed. I saw how the financial consequences simultaneously overlapped with the social ones. Fund documents they'd overlooked or forgotten to complete on time began to create bureaucratic problems. Transfers and payments were delayed. Routine travel and shopping plans were ruined, and calls from partners and colleagues only increased their stress and confusion. The domestic aspect of the disaster manifested itself in their inability to coordinate family affairs, delegate responsibilities, maintain order, and answer questions from children and relatives. Every misstep, every forgotten detail, created new conflicts and nervousness that instantly spread, amplifying the avalanche effect. The psychological pressure became almost unbearable. I watched as the nanny yelled at the children, who had already stopped fearing her, and as my father's ex-wife tried to save face in front of relatives and friends, but her attempts backfired, and each new argument only eroded the remnants of her authority. The children openly expressed dissatisfaction and surprise. Relatives exchanged glances. Family friends tentatively asked questions. And the nanny and my father's ex-wife looked confused and defenseless. I watched with an incredible sense of satisfaction. The entire plan, which had been in the making for months, worked perfectly. The consequences of their mistakes, their nervousness, their inability to coordinate their actions, and their desire for control manifested themselves simultaneously in every area of their lives. Everything happened naturally, without my intervention, and this made the revenge especially sweet. They had created their own catastrophe, and now they were experiencing it in real time, in front of everyone who could witness it. The climax came when one of the children, noticing the nanny losing control, bluntly declared that he no longer wanted to follow her instructions, and a relative supported him, openly doing so. This became a symbolic moment when the power of the nanny and her ally completely collapsed, and attempts to maintain authority resulted in even more noticeable mistakes and panicked reactions. Their reputations within the family, among friends, neighbors, and the foundation's volunteers were destroyed simultaneously. Everyone could see their inability to cope with the situation, their nervousness, panicked movements, and uncoordinated actions. I witnessed how financial, domestic, social, and psychological consequences overlapped, creating an avalanche that was now unstoppable. They tried to save themselves, justify themselves, or shift responsibility to others, but all efforts seemed unnatural and only intensified the effect of the collapse. At that moment, I realized their revenge plan had been fully executed. Their normal life had fallen apart, their authority had been lost, their social network had been destroyed, the trust of their children and relatives had been lost. Financial and domestic problems continued to weigh heavily, and their psyche couldn't withstand the pressure. All of this was unfolding before the eyes of everyone involved, and I could calmly watch as the consequences of their actions spiraled into complete and utter collapse. The final moment came when the nanny, attempted to establish some kind of order, but her attempts were met with indifference and open resistance from the children and relatives. My father's ex-wife desperately tried to intervene, but no one would listen, and I watched as their illusion of control finally vanished. Everything they thought was a safe and comfortable life turned into chaos and public defeat, and I, standing outside this avalanche, watched the final act of revenge, which occurred without my direct participation, but completely corresponded to the plan and expectations that I had been building for months, patiently and methodically, step by step, bringing their lives to a final collapse simultaneously in all areas, leaving them to cope with the consequences themselves.